I don't want to badmouth the dude, but I see you guys always talk about that championship stuff. I try to tell y'all, all these bus riders, they don't mean nothing to me. If you ain't driving the bus, don't walk around talking about you're a champion. If you riding the bus, I don't want to hear it.
It's become somewhat of an annual tradition that once the NBA playoffs begin, the level of toxicity rises amongst NBA fan bases and in the media. The sensationalized game-to-game overreactions on social media and talk shows during the postseason are taken to a new height, creating an environment rife with false narratives that take on a life of their own among many casual fans. In this video, I'm going to focus on a couple of the most common narratives that popped up during this year's playoffs and expose the lies within them. Narrative number 1. Centers are going extinct because small ball dominates in the playoffs. For the past several years now, we've seen this narrative pop up in the playoffs where centers have increasingly been getting played off the floor by smaller, quicker lineups that can expose the defensive shortcomings of a lot of big men. We started seeing this trend back in 2015 with the Warriors' small ball death lineup and have seen other teams adopt this strategy in an effort to emulate that success. Many have concluded that the future is to go small and there's no longer a place for the traditional big in the modern NBA, or at least when it comes to postseason play. Like many myths, there are components of truth that make it believable, but to broadly indict all centers is an oversimplification of the real issue. The truth is there are key areas that can get exposed in the postseason that leave some centers vulnerable who are deficient in those areas, while those centers who are not can still thrive. The playoffs differ from the regular season in that teams stray away from running design plays and sets and lean more heavily into hunting mismatches and playing off isolation. In order to be on the floor as a big man, you must be able to guard in space on the perimeter. The centers who cannot are the ones who get played off the floor, and that's why there were a number of centers who saw decreases in productivity this postseason. A couple examples of centers who are flawed in this area are high-scoring big men like Jonas Valanciunas and Nikola Vucevic, who, because of their lack of foot speed, routinely get cooked when switched onto smaller, quicker guards. While these sort of big men are often recognized for their ability to stuff the stat sheet from a scoring and rebounding perspective, their inability to defend in space makes each of them much less valuable to their teams once the playoffs begin. In addition to having the ability to defend in space, your center needs the ability to counter small ball lineups with the ability to punish smaller defenders in the paint. While it's become an annual custom among basketball fans on NBA Twitter to slander multiple-time Defensive Player of the Year Rudy Gobert for his postseason deficiencies, I believe people mistakenly look at his defense as the reason he struggles, as opposed to the real reason, his lack of offensive postgame. If you look at the defensive footage for the Jazz this postseason, Rudy was actually quite solid on that end. It's unfair to blame him for Utah's defensive lapses where he has to guard the paint and cover for his perimeter defenders who allow guards to blow right by them for easy paint touches. However, where Rudy did hurt the Jazz was his lack of offensive game inside the paint, failing to punish the Mavs' small ball lineup on the interior. With no real post game or feel inside, he becomes too easy to defend, and now the Mavs can get away with playing their best offensive lineup without the worry of being attacked inside on the other end. While the issues with many of the game's centers can be glaring in the postseason, on the flip side, those centers who do possess both the ability to defend on the perimeter and punish small ball inside were extremely impactful to their team runs. Kevon Looney, for example, is not a big name, but he was able to affect the game more than several big-name scoring or all-star centers because he has the agility and the discipline to switch onto guards and the size and feel to finish over them easily on the other end. Rob Williams is another example of a role-playing center who is key for the Celtics with his paint protection and lob threat ability. Like Looney, Rob Williams was able to stay on the floor because of his quick feet that allow him to hold his own and recover against quicker guards. It's not a coincidence that the two teams that met in the finals each had a great role-playing center. It demonstrates the value centers still have in the league today, but that you have to know which skills matter from a big man in the postseason. If you're overly focused on box score numbers, you will end up overpaying for a big man that can get easily exposed and have his role reduced when it matters. Because of this, I'd be wary of giving max money or anything close to it to any center outside of no-brainer superstar talents like Nikola Jokic or Joel Embiid. If these past playoffs serve as any guide, they tell us that you can find championship-level big men for a bargain if you understand what's valuable this time of year. DeAndre Ayton, for example, is set to make major money, and he's obviously a very highly talented player, but he was less effective against a team like the Mavs than the lesser-known and appreciated Kevon Looney. On this possession here, Ayton's pre-programmed instincts around the rim causes him to miss what should have been an easy dunk. Is this really worth max money when it can be replaced by a role player for a fraction of the cost? Every team has to decide what they value, but the evidence is crystal clear. The unique style that comes with postseason basketball can make your center expendable if they lack the necessary ability to counter small ball lineups. The center position as a whole will never go extinct, but teams that make the mistake of overpaying for outdated archetypes at the position will continue to suffer the consequences when it counts. Narrative number 2. The Mavs are a one-man team. Luka has no help. This is probably hands down the most frustrating narrative I saw throughout this postseason, but anytime you have a great player who is very ball dominant, this sort of narrative can be expected to emerge. The quality of Luka's supporting cast was diminished during the entirety of their run because they don't have guys with the same pedigree as other elite teams, but that doesn't mean his supporting cast wasn't very impactful. It's just that understanding the value of the so-called others on the Mavs roster requires a deeper dive into the offensive system the Mavs run and the roster construction this particular style demands. The Mavs run an offensive style that is now commonly referred to as heliocentrism, describing an offensive system that revolves around one player who is both a high-level scorer and playmaker. It consists primarily of high pick and roll, with Luka attempting to get the switch he prefers on the perimeter, where he can then either score off isolation or get into the paint and make a play for one of the spot-up shooters or rolling lob threats. The most comparable past example of this style was the Houston Rockets offense during the Harden era. These superstar offensive players, by virtue of having the ball in their hands for such a large share of their team's possessions, have to be surrounded by players who can add value without the ball, and that tends to mean spot-up 3-and-D wings and rim-running type centers. This naturally limits the type of players you can consider when constructing a roster because most star offensive players are at the best with the ball in their hands too. You can't simply add big-name stars thinking those players will add the same amount of value in a heliocentric offense that they do in their current teams because of the diminishing returns that come with ball dominance. There's only one basketball, and the more that one player has it, the less the other four on the court will. So while the Mavs don't have another big all-star type name, they have a lot of high-end role players who are perfect fits to add value in this system. Finney-Smith and Bullock are your versatile defensive wings who can snipe from distance. Kleba is a stretch big who can also defend in the perimeter. And then you have starting level guards in Brunson and Dinwiddie who can score and create with the ball in their hands, but sacrifice the full extent of their skill set to fit in a heliocentric system that often leaves them standing in the corner waiting for a kickout pass from Doncic. One objective way you know the cast is better than given credit for is by looking at the on-off numbers. If you look at how the team fares against their opponents independent of Luka, you can see that they are much better than people realize. Luka has had a near neutral on-off differential for all 4 years of his career, and this past season his differential was actually a slight negative, meaning the Mavs outscored their opponents by slightly more when he was on the bench than on the court. Now, I'm not saying the Mavs are better without Luka, obviously not. But it is impossible to explain this statistic if you take the position that Luka has no help. In the postseason, his supporting cast stepped up big time in the first round, beating the Utah Jazz in 2 of the 3 games Luka missed, led by Jalen Brunson playing like an all-star, as well as big games by Maxi Kleber and Dorian Finney-Smith during that stretch. It's easy to look at a roster with one stat-stuffing megastar that lacks another big name and run with the agenda that lack of star power is the reason they struggled. But that's a lazy take that fails to comprehend what gave them success this season in the first place. My intent isn't to slander Luka in any way by pointing these things out, but simply recognize the full picture of the Mavs' success to give the other players the credit they deserve, because it's extremely disrespectful to their impact and factually untrue when people act like Luka is the sole reason they've won. The real issues we saw that can be objectively measured were the Mavs' lack of interior presence, which led to major disadvantages in the rebounding battle, and lack of rim protection. Heliocentric offenses will always rely on a disproportionately high volume of three-point shooting relative to their opponents, which will leave your team vulnerable to the high variance that comes with it. This is why some games the Mavs look like the best team on the planet when those shots are falling, and other games it appears that Luka has to do it all. These flaws are inherent to the system they've chosen and will remain that way as long as they continue to run it. There's no doubt the Mavs will need to make roster improvements to catapult themselves into true contender status, but how they go about doing that is the question. You can go after all the stars you want, but it's a mistake to assume those stars will retain the full extent of their offensive impact when transferred into a system where they would spend the majority of possessions playing off ball. I hope you enjoyed this video. Be sure to comment and let me know if you agree or disagree. Also, be sure to stay tuned as I'll be highlighting more players soon, and with free agency set to begin shortly, there will likely be a few hidden gems that will benefit from a new opportunity going into next season.